Happy Earth Day. My name is Julie Ty and I'm president of the New York League of Conservation Voters Education Fund. At NYLCVEF, we educate, engage, and empower New Yorkers to be effective advocates for the environment. One of the ways we do that is we hold candidate forums so that you can learn more about where candidates stand on the environment and sustainability. Because we were not able to hold an in-person event this year, we met with candidates individually at City Hall Park and at Battery Park so that we could hear from them about where they stand on the environment, sustainability, and climate change. Because the next mayor has a monumental task. We cannot afford to wait anymore on climate change. We must act. We need plans and we need real actions to deliver on our need to meet zero emissions by 2050. That means increasing the amount of recycling we do. It means protecting our world-class drinking water supply and keeping it clean. It means investing in our parks and our green spaces. It means greening our transportation sector and investing in resilient infrastructure to protect our communities from flooding and from the impacts of heat. We hope you watch tonight and learn more about where the candidates stand and where they're making climate and the environment a priority. We want you to take these lessons with you when you go to the polls this June.
Got to stop citing peaker plants and dirty diesel bus garages in communities of color. That's what COVID exposed, the environmental racism of land use decisions made over generations of mayors.
Whether or not we're talking about transportation or we're talking about housing, we're talking about climate change. We need to ensure that Local Law 97 is actually implemented and that we are not focused on fines or fees, but on helping people actually achieve the goal of decarbonizing our economy. We know that that means we need to bring more renewable power into this city, both from Canadian hydro as well as from upstate. Solar, wind, geothermal, all have to be part of the mix.
This is an existential crisis with which I have lived my entire life. I grew up across the street from a paper mill that used to emit fumes so strong that the only way we could breathe is open the refrigerator door. Down the street to the right, which is a dead end, was a levee, and I was worried about whether or not that levee, the water was going to come and breach the levee.
We have to first properly identify what is causing the greenhouse gases, and then have a real attack to resolve the issues using not only manpower and woman power, but also technology.
And when I'm elected, New York City will once again be the leading city on climate change in the world. Well, first and foremost, we're going to make sure that we once again partner with the rest of the country and the rest of the world to be a leader again on climate change. My 6,000-word climate plan, it's here in my plan for New York City. It's been endorsed by Gina McCarthy. No other candidate has the relationships and the knowledge of how to build partnerships in Albany, in Washington, and across this country with other mayors to make sure that New York City is a leader again on climate change.
We're going to build a solar panel on every rooftop and an electric battery in every basement.
We know that there are many communities, particularly of color, that have been overburdened by environmental nuisances or toxins. We need to make sure that there is a Green New Deal for NYCHA, that they have the funding to ensure that they are investing in geothermal and in heat pumps. So not only do they have heat and hot water, but also that they have air conditioning in those units.
If you look at my economic comeback plan, which is at its core is infrastructure. And infrastructure is defined as how do we combat the existential crisis that is the climate. And so my plan looks to build climate resiliency, focusing on not only air, but what's taking place with a 100-year flood that comes every 5 years.
My full frontal assault on greenhouse gases will be matched with the full frontal assault that greenhouse gases is attacking our planet.
On buildings, our biggest source of emissions. Not only am I going to accelerate implementation of Local Law 97, get the tools and resources like PACE to every building that needs it, but we're also going to lead with our public buildings. We're going to make sure that public housing is a model around the world for sustainable green housing.
We are going to invest in an infrastructure that speaks to the green economy, because here's our opportunity. We can retrofit all of the dirty buildings in the city. We can adopt Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's NYCHA Green Plan. That's what the future holds. And the way we do it is by creating hundreds of thousands of jobs.
We need to make sure we're electrifying our school buses and that we are electrifying our school fleet, that we are actually making it possible to have more public chargers.
Building and making certain that we've dealt with coastlines that we have in Hunts Point and Red Hook and the Rockaways and Coney Island and yes, in Lower Manhattan. We have a resiliency plan on which we've never executed. So the only thing that we have in reserve are sandbags.
We're going to look at our overconsumption of meat in this city. It is time to have a more healthy food source on where we feed people in government, such as schools, prisons. People don't realize that meat and our overconsumption of meat is destroying our Amazon. It is destroying our environment. It's not only unhealthy and is hurting our mothers and children, but it's hurting Mother Earth.
That's going to be key to all of our plans, is leading on buildings. I'm going to make sure within the first 100 days of a Donovan administration, we issue an all-of-government executive order on environmental justice. We're going to increase the use of social vulnerability mapping and all kinds of other tools to really know where the impacts are the greatest and where we need to focus our resources. And I'm going to create real accountability by appointing the first ever Chief Equity Officer in the history of this city, reporting directly to me. Every agency will be accountable to those goals on environmental justice, and we will actually make sure that climate change no longer disproportionately devastates our communities of color.
We can retrain and develop a talent pool in communities of color by accessing workforce development programs that I've proposed for CUNY students, make them free, give kids a retrofitting career opportunity. The next step on the road to a renewable New York City is the green economy.
We're going to have a full frontal assault on the current peaker plants. We're going to change and use battery storage so that we can cycle off of our current use that is attacking our greenhouse gases. We're going to have a real greenhouse bond program where we're going to put people back to real employment of how they participated in cleaning our environment. And then look at our sea levels. There's a real racial injustice when you look at it. Almost 1 out of every 10 NYCHA developments is located in flood zones. So the goal is, how do we rebuild our parkland, our parking areas? How do we build the right infrastructure to prevent the flooding and really get our zones and communities protected in that area?
So we need to reimagine our streets, not only make our open streets program permanent, but actually ensure that we're bringing new modes of transit and mobility to our city in a safe and environmentally friendly way. Well, that means certainly dedicated lanes for bus rapid transit, but it also means protected lanes for bikes and other modes of micro-mobility. It also means ensuring that all of those buses move quickly through our city with traffic signaling priority.
This is a real opportunity to reimagine the public realm and put the public back at the forefront of it.
Number one, we need to expedite the electric bus rollout. And we need to do it based on health numbers in communities. I stood up and spoke out against the failure to remove diesel buses from East New York and Brownsville and other parts of the city where we had high asthma rates and high health conditions that stem from greenhouse gases.
We have got to have decisive action when it comes to greening our buses, greening our city fleets. I will accelerate that on day one I take office. Think about this. 80% of New York City is sidewalks and streets. but yet cars control 70% of those streets. If you take away one parking space, you could park 20 bicycles. And if you take away 3 cars, suddenly you have outdoor dining and a restaurant.
It is critical that we deal with congestion. We're trying to get to net zero, at least 80% to net zero by 2050. We need to make certain that we re-electrify or electrify most of the vehicles that exist as part of just take the public system, the public school buses, 10,000 school buses. Let's see if we can make those electric.
We also need to make every single public vehicle an EV. We need to have charging stations everywhere so it's easier for New Yorkers. We've got to lead with our MTA buses, which I would make sure we're all electric, and our school buses as well. And guess what? They can also serve in our next crisis, whether it's the next hurricane or other climate disaster. They can be our community hubs, ensuring that everyone has power from those electric cells.
We have to electrify our school buses, and we have to electrify our entire city fleet. This is going to mean investments in infrastructure to ensure that we have the power at our facilities to charge them. I'm committed to getting that done.
We're also going to have open streets. We must pedestrianize our streets, particularly in our central business district where we have high transportation. There's no reason to have cars having a large amount of accessibility in those areas where you have high transit, high rich areas. We can turn them into open streets. We're going to do protected bike lanes. We're going to ensure that we have a real rapid transit system and bus lines.
So my plan is to build 35 miles per year of busways. My plan is to make sure that we have real dedicated bus lanes and bike lanes. We should look at our streets and say, how can we build safely for 8-year-olds? Because if we think like that, we're also going to build safely for 80-year-olds, and that will protect people.
When it comes to all city vehicles, we should make those electric, but we also, as we're doing this, make sure we have enough electric charging stations, that we do whatever we can to emit emissions, like congestion pricing, like making certain that we get as much solar energy and wind powered as we can get. We need to transform this city. We also need to make certain that we open up bike lanes and open up parks. Outdoor experiences are what influence and inspire our lives. So we need to make certain that we focus on that.
When it comes to transportation, we have to think creatively about a multimodal system where you can take your city bike to the bus stop, or you take the bus to the train. That there is a one-swipe pass, and we are making it easy and efficient for you to get around.
And we're going to encourage safe pathways and passageways for children riding their bikes to and from school, to encourage real healthy ways of understanding how to use alternative methods of moving about the city. And then we are going to create super high bike highways under elevated structures, under elevated highways, and really encourage people to ride bikes throughout the city in a safe way.
We do not have to have a car culture that's accelerating motorists and motor vehicles. What we really should be thinking about is what the post-Robert Moses era is going to look like for this city. Let's look at the Bronx, the Cross-Bronx Expressway, the Bruckner Express. These are all superhighways that polluted neighborhoods and also divided communities. I want to take a fresh look and offer the biggest, boldest environmental plan that the city's ever seen, because this is the time to do it.
What we must do is to continue to understand the connectivity between parks and open space and how that impacts on our health. The data is clear. The social determinants of health is not only what we put in our mouths, but is what we absorb with our eyes. Not having open space, not having parks will actually impact on our emotional health, our mental health, and really our physical health.
You know, LCV was right many years ago. It's called 1% for parks, and we should be investing in all of our communities. There are parks that are big and beautiful, and there's a whole lot of private funding attached to it. But as we open up our streets and make open streets permanent, let's build 200 playgrounds in the next 5 years for our kids. That's called equity for children who don't have the park advantages. Let's take 1% of the city budget so that we upkeep our parks, that we accelerate capital projects.
Look at many of the lower income communities. They have half of the park space that many of the better resource communities have. All New Yorkers are deserving of making certain that they have great outdoor spaces so that we can convene as families and so we can interact as New Yorkers. Parks are essential.
One of the things that we saw during the pandemic is how critical our parks were to not only our physical health, but also to our mental health, to a place where we could do yoga or meet our friends for cocktails or be able to just read a book. They were our living rooms in a way that they have never been before, and we have to think of parks as infrastructure. When I'm mayor, I will increase the budget for parks to 1% of the total budget by the end of my first term.
For me, this commitment begins at home. I'm married to a landscape architect who's designed public parks and gardens all over this city and across the country. And I know that, especially in this moment where getting outside is so important and so special, that every New Yorker has to have access to a park.
And then we must do a GIS mapping system to look at every community and see within 15 minutes of one's home, there's a park or an open space. We must reinvest in open plazas. We must reinvest in utilizing spaces around our schools. A lot of the parks and places where we're parking cars on those open spaces need to be utilized to turn into green spaces.
But we need to invest in parks and communities that don't have them. And that is why I will make sure that we are investing 10 new parks in these communities, but also creating green boulevards between our green spaces so that we have the opportunity to clean our air and ensure that people are connected to their green spaces. At many NYCHA developments, there are large pieces of green space that have fences all the way around them. And we know that those could be converted into space that is really usable for the residents, but also for the community, and integrate those developments into the overall community.
We should look at what the Central Park Conservancy has done. Instead of going through the bureaucracy of the Department of Parks, we should duplicate how rapid the conservancies and Prospect Park Alliance and others have been able to move projects forward. And I would encourage the partnership with some of the communities that have traditionally been denied having open space to be adopted by the conservancies and Prospect Park Alliances and others to really show them how to turn around their parks, how to do crowdsource funding, how to raise the money, and how to turn their green spaces into a beautiful place.
New York City has the least green space per person of any city in the country. And that has to change, especially for our communities, Black and brown communities, disadvantaged communities that have been left behind for too long. You know, there are over 1 million people in the city of New York that don't have a park within 10 minutes walk of their home. That has to change.
Part of the new city is to create equity, open space, public space.
Farming. I just did a report on the new agrarian economy. I believe we should allocate 10% of all of our park spaces to farming, showing how to have community gardens where we can grow healthy food, identify food deserts in our city, and actually grow healthy food so our children can be reintroduced to the whole process of growing healthy food and consuming healthy food at the same time.
And I think back to the days in the 70s when Gordon Davis restructured the parks as the head of the Parks Commission. We need to return to that kind of vision today, especially in this current COVID environment. Outdoor spaces are key to how we revive and recover this great city.
We know that the third of our waste comes from food and yard waste. We have to bring back the composting program and ensure that it is at everybody's doorstep, as well as in every big building. It's gonna have to be mandatory. But we also need to have community compost facilities in all 5 boroughs. And I've committed to a renewable Rikers, so not only for renewable power, but also to have a place to make compost so that we can return it to all of our green spaces. I believe that we can get to zero waste, and I am absolutely the person to do it.
We collect 50% less than what we set out the goal to be. We need to focus on that. We need to focus on composting.
So let's get real about this. One, pick up the garbage, but more importantly, stop using garbage bags. One of those parking spaces we talked about, we could put a dumpster right there. That's a healthy way of disposing garbage. That's an idea.
You know, when people think of the waste in this city, what they don't realize is that we are wasting money. It is no longer inexpensive to send our garbage out of the city, to transport garbage away. The real savings will come from investing in the long-term infrastructure of processing our waste.
New York only recycles about 1/5 of its waste, when other cities like San Francisco and Seattle are 3 times that level. We've got to lead the country in recycling, and we're going to do that by bringing back organics recycling and making sure it works everywhere.
Let's start composting for real. They've gutted the composting plant. We only have 1% composting in a city that it should be scaled up to lead the nation. Why aren't we thinking strategically about investing in the kind of separation of bottles and paper and goods and recycling? We haven't had a new idea in approaching this in the city in the last 40 years. Time to do that.
Climate has got to be the highest priority, and we keep moving it out. We keep moving it out as though it's not the issue that it really is. So my plan is to address this and to address it directly and to make sure that it's the highest priority. We have no alternative.
We're going to create an organic waste collection and ensure that we turn it over to the Grow NYC and other places of creating compost and really having a citywide organic waste renewal program. We must lead by example, and we can't say that communities such as NYCHA residents can't participate in the program. That is just unfair, and it sends the wrong message.
And so I would implement for the first time ever a serious construction waste recycling program to ensure that we're really leading the country again in recycling.
My goal as mayor is going to ensure that every New Yorker participate in the organic waste renewal program. And we're going to start with our schools. We're going to make sure every school has a composting bin, have an organic waste renewal program so that our children can learn at an early age that this is part of the process of getting rid of waste and how we ensure that we don't destroy our environment. I believe that the death of Mr. Floyd, ironically, is giving life to our understanding that we have been doing things just wrong. And one of the areas we have been really showing a level of injustice is how we have dealt with environmental injustices.
The mentality of, well, just put it uptown has to stop, because for too long we put dirty bus depot stations uptown in Harlem and Washington Heights.
I would substantially increase the amount of work we're doing to measure the real impacts in communities around the country, social vulnerability mapping, and all these other tools that other places around the country are using, but we're not using here in New York City nearly enough.
As we think about reimagining our city, we know that there are places that have been burdened, whether it was waste transfer stations or power plants, with real negative aspects of what we all need to actually be here in the city of New York. When we think about what we are citing, we need to ensure that we are not citing them in neighborhoods that are already overburdened.
We know that we have issues of lead, we have issues of mold. In many of the lower income communities, we've yet to do anything about this. We keep talking about it, we keep issuing press releases, but yet the circumstances, the issues persist. At some point, we got to be tired of being tired. Enough is enough. We cannot allow our kids to be exposed to this kind of environmental injustice, and it needs to be the highest priority. I recognize that, given the circumstances under which I grew up. There was nobody for me to call.
We have to recognize that as we create a cleaner environment in the city, we also have to make sure that we no longer burden our communities. And there is a correlation between environmental racism and high rates of asthma, type 2 diabetes, creating weaker immune systems. And rather than deal with that through the lens of health disparities and solving these problems, we basically managed the health disparities without solving them. The next mayor has to step up and work with communities to get this done.
This is a time now where we must analyze everything from waste treatment plants to what type of buses we're using in certain communities, such as diesel buses, how we are ensuring the access to green space. All of these entities must be analyzed with an inequality test to see, are we disproportionately impacting other communities over others? And that must be reviewed monthly in real time. We must use technology as we make these decisions on where we're going to open treatment plants, how we're going to allocate park funding, how we're going to roll out electric buses.
This is where we need to ensure that there is money for parks, that there are new green spaces in these locations. Many of them are actually near water bodies and are an opportunity for us to gain real access back to our waterfront. I envision that we would be investing our money in schoolyards that are currently asphalt and turning them into green spaces with a priority on those neighborhoods that have been harmed by our environmental justice issues.
I would reorient the way we plan the city around what I call 15-minute neighborhoods. What's a 15-minute neighborhood? Within 15 minutes of your front door, you have everything you need to live a life of opportunity. A great school for your kids, a great job that sustains your family, or transportation that gets you there quickly. But you also have the healthcare and all of the other advantages that you need. We're also going to be looking at making sure that we're not putting our peaker plants and other environmental hazards into Black and brown communities.
So this has to be also another instance of this has to be the highest priority. We can't allow these situations to persist and talk about it and do nothing about it.
You know, it makes no sense to me that you would identify a child with lead in one building, but you wouldn't then go in and test every child in the building.
I'd make certain that we went and tested, that we have a scorecard, and where we saw lead, that we do whatever it took to remediate it immediately.
New York City actually has the benefit of some of the strongest lead laws in the nation. We just aren't using them. But we also need to make sure we are getting the message out to parents that they need their children tested for lead.
We need to be lead poison identifiers. There must be a partnership with the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, the Department of Education, and health in hospitals.
I have led on lead throughout my entire career. When I came in as housing commissioner, I went to work implementing Local Law 1, the most far-reaching lead paint law in the country. When I was HUD secretary for President Obama, I made sure that our Healthy Homes initiative dramatically improved the health and wellness of our children all around the city and all around the country.
I don't think we fully appreciate that when a kid gets lead poisoning, this could be something that stays with the child for the rest of their lives. And I do think that when we've looked at this in NYCHA, We've also found many other agencies that should be working together. We find those agency silos.
And we must use technology and a GIS mapping system to identify clusters. And once you identify clusters, then you can send in teams on the ground to do real education and immediate abatement. I stood up when I learned that NYCHA was failing to identify and properly abate many apartments where lead was present. We should have identified those clusters.
I'd make certain that we have the appropriate people, the experts, the unbiased experts, who made certain that this was a priority, and we went through and identified where the issues are and took every step available to me as the mayor to immediately address it.
Agencies have to work together and collaborate. We need to ensure that every vacant apartment is completely abated for lead. We need to do spot checks of other apartments, particularly where we have landlords that over and over again have a child poisoned by lead. We know where the bad actors are. We need to focus our resources on those.
It's also about making sure that every time the city is in an apartment, whether it's our nurse-family partnership, visiting expecting mothers at home, whether it's the work we're doing with our housing inspections to look at other challenges in our housing, every time we ought to make sure that we're communicating in the right language, in the right way with those residents of New York City.
As the mayor, I'm going to make sure that, again, we are going to use technology to identify the cluster areas, partner with a deployment team to go into these areas, do education, let parents know what are the early signs, and make sure we give the children the proper medical treatment that they deserve to catch lead poisoning early.
Green jobs are part of my overall infrastructure plan, where we're going to look to see if we can't make certain that the climate resiliency creates jobs, look at how we retrofit buildings to make them green, installing solar panels, as we create stations for electric vehicles, as we think about proximity on-demand services in many of our garages, retrofitting those, creating jobs to retrofit those.
You know, our buildings, our unhealthy buildings produce 73% of all emissions in the city. So we have to implement Local Law 97. We have to retrofit those buildings. We have to recognize that we have 28% of our emissions are also due to cars. So when you put it all together, we're going to have to invest in a green infrastructure that actually does the work of cleaning up those buildings and those streets. And that is the whole green economy for working people. And to get there, we need to do the kind of workforce development to train the next generation.
I'm going to implement a Green Bond Act where we are going to turn the city into a green economy. I laid out an agrarian report that partnered with Cornell University, NYU School of Business, and we see the real economic advantage of turning our city into an agrarian economy. Why is that important? Because by growing our own food, we deal with the food apartheid or food deserts. But we also take trucks off the road and we improve our economy by less diesel fuel. And we deal with the health aspects of eating a healthier diet. And the best part of this is that it creates jobs.
We know that that is going to transition many things. Our heating systems, our hot water systems. Training people now, particularly our young people, on how to care for these systems and how to design them will make it so we have a more equitable and a greener New York.
I'm the only candidate in this race who's worked side by side with President Biden, Vice President Harris through the worst crises our city and our country have faced. And I'm the only one who knows how to go to work in the federal budget, because I was budget director for President Obama, to make sure that New York is getting its fair share of those resources. Then what we need to do is make sure we're putting that money to work, making New York the greenest, most sustainable city on earth, and to do it, creating jobs for those who are too often left behind. I would build a Green Climate Corps, modeled on programs we started in the Obama administration, that would put our young people to work, create apprenticeships and pre-apprenticeships.
There are a menu of items out there, a menu of projects that we can undertake that create green jobs. And we also need to make certain that for these green jobs that we have workforce training so that the New Yorkers who have become unemployed today can be the employees of the future tomorrow. This is a great opportunity for us to focus on that.
The next multi-billion-dollar, $30 billion economy over the next 10 years is the green economy. And we have to make sure that green economy works in all of our communities for all of our children, and that is what I'm going to focus on as mayor.
So I'm going to open more CTE schools like I have at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where we are going to turn this city into a pipeline of educating our children for solar panels, wind farms, how to build out new technology around green jobs.
I intend to make sure that we are utilizing our CUNY system as well as our trade schools. We need to make sure they have the skill set to take care of these motors and inverters and everything else that comes along with the green economy.
What would they do? They would build solar on the rooftops of our public housing. They would make sure that all of the wind turbines that are going to be out off the coast of Long Island are assembled, built, and maintained by New Yorkers with a port here in our city.
The biggest mistake we can make is to have a green economy with green jobs, with a green bond program, but we don't have our children being educated on how to fill those jobs. They must be part of the future by not only understanding the importance of the environment, but also having the skills to be employed in improving the environment. And I'm going to build out that pipeline, and I'm excited about the thought because education is exciting our children to see the civic engagements they will have by having a job that they are improving the city that they live in. Prospect Park. Is there another park? I love the intimacy of it. I love it's not too big. The diversity as you move through the park. You see so many different groups that's there. And it is our south of France. It is our Bahamas. It is the poor man's first date. It is just a great place to enjoy the city and the borough.
You know, as a kid growing up uptown in Washington Heights, Fort Tryon Park was just where we went, where we played, and I appreciate it now as a father, as I move around the different parks in the city with my own kids. It brings back just a lot of memories.
Prospect Park is my favorite park. I grew up not too far from there, and I have some lovely members occasionally of grabbing a 40.
I love Central Park, just given all the vast and rich experiences from the Ramble to Sheep's Meadow to me going to the lower part of the northern part of Central Park and trying to make sure that I can use the bike to get back up, or Hudson River Park. I love to play basketball in Central Park. I also love to play basketball with my 8-year-old in Riverside Park.
I gotta say this is an easy one for me. It's Brooklyn Bridge Park, just a few minutes walk from our home. And why? Because my wife is a landscape architect who helped design it. And so we walk through that park. She knows the names of every one of the plants. She has nicknames for them. It feels like home to us. And we love running, walking, biking, and everything in between in Brooklyn Bridge Park.
The 8 train when I was growing up was a lifeline, but now it's still the #1 and the 2 train. And I've been riding the rail since I was a little kid in New York. You know, our big adventures would go from Washington Heights downtown, but we also mostly went on the bus to Fordham Road. And that was our world, and transit and bikes, and this opened up the way we saw New York City.
The R train, it is slow but steady.
A train. I love this our subway system. I think it's the best on the globe. Yes, we have a lot of improvements, but the A train is my train.
As a real New Yorker, I measure the different phases of my life from the subway lines that I take during those periods. As a kid, I rode the 4, 5, and 6 all the time. When I was raising my kids on Bergen Street, the F train was our lifeline in the city, whether it was heading into the city or going to Coney Island to the aquarium or to swim on the beach. And now it's the A and the C, right there in downtown Brooklyn, that gets me everywhere I need to go.
I take the B, the C, the D, the E, the F, the 1, 2, and 3. Depends on if I'm on the east side or the west side. And I also take city bike, and now I have my own bike. So I take a lot of different public transportation.
I do, and I'm proud to say my reusable water bottle is a 2020 bottle. 2020 is my younger son's rock band, and I'm a proud roadie, groupie for their band.
I carry a reusable bag and a reusable water bottle that actually tells me every few hours how much water I should drink, that I meet my goals every day.
Of course I do.
And I have a particular favorite reusable bag, which would be, I don't know, mine, the 0x30 bag, which I always am thrilled to see. I love the fact that it's orange because it's easy to spot. And I do like the stainless steel water bottles over the plastic. It keeps it cold.
A reusable water bottle, mostly though, until now, I've been Zooming with a regular glass of water. Now I'm going to make a just transition into the street safely, so I will bring all that I need to showcase my healthy agenda.
I do compost at home, but it is very frustrating to not be able to put meat or dairy into my compost.
We're working on composting at home.
I'm married to a landscape architect, of course I compost at home.
No, but I recycle like a fiend. Just today, before I met you, I did the separates.
Yes, I do, and at Borough Hall. I compost at both locations.
I love the loop around Central Park, but I also love Hudson River Park. We're so blessed and fortunate to have those options and those opportunities, and we want those opportunities to exist in every neighborhood, for every child and every family in New York, all New Yorkers to experience, because that's what helps make New York what it is.
I was a biking kid growing up, and now I mostly chase my kids' bikes.
I love the Brooklyn Greenway. I love the Brooklyn Waterfront Park, but I also do Prospect Park all the time.
Ooh, I like to bike down along the Brooklyn shoreline to Coney Island. You just got to make sure you do it early on the boardwalk.
As a New Yorker who grew up riding bikes, learned to ride a bike on the streets of this city, I pretty much love biking anywhere, but my current favorite is the route I do through Prospect Park, down Ocean Parkway, out to Coney Island, back along the water under the Verrazano Bridge, ending up at the pier in Red Hook to watch the sun come down. That is the best way to end a beautiful day.
Thank you, and happy Earth Day again to everyone. I want to thank tonight's sponsor, National Grid. Now, please join us for some insight and commentary on the topics we just heard about. We have a panel of advocates with us to expand a little bit more on the plans that the candidates shared. Here with us tonight are New Yorkers for Parks Executive Director Adam Ganzer, South Bronx Unite co-founder Michael Johnson, Riders Alliance Director of Policy and Communications Danny Pearlstein, and Urban Green Council Associate Director of Policy Chris Halfnight. Let's start by talking about emissions. We all know that real actions must be taken on emissions very soon in order to address the worsening effects of climate change, especially when it comes to the building sector. Chris, how well did the candidates address this issue in the video? Were there any critical points that they've left out?
Well, Julie, we know that nearly 70% of New York City's total emissions come from the energy used in buildings. It's an enormous piece of the emissions pie. And I think we heard really from all of the candidates that decarbonizing the building sector is a top priority. And at Urban Green, we think the next mayor needs to double down on that priority. Many, really all of the candidates mentioned or alluded to Local Law 97. That's the new law that places carbon caps on the energy used in the city's large buildings. Those caps kick in 2024, but between now and then, we have a lot of work to do to make sure that law gets implemented successfully. And the next administration needs to work closely with the city's advisory board under Local Law 97 to make sure we get implementation right. Many of the candidates mentioned as well items like replacing peaker plants, retrofits in public housing, and getting more renewables into New York City's grid. Those are all great priorities. It was fantastic to hear that. Two priorities for urban green that we didn't hear stressed are: one, building electrification. So that's transitioning heating and hot water systems from fossil fuels to electricity. Right now, about 40% of the city's total emissions come from burning oil and gas for heat and hot water in buildings. The next mayor needs to focus on outreach, education, training, and support to help make that transition happen. And then secondly, strategies for New York City's other 1 million buildings. So a lot of our policy development for building energy and carbon has focused on the large buildings, but 95% of our buildings are under 25,000 square feet, and they account for almost half of the building emissions in the city. So we'd like to see the next administration focus on some policy development to decarbonize that sector as well.
Thank you. Building on the topic of emissions, we know that communities of color and low-income neighborhoods are unfairly burdened by the harmful effects of pollution and waste. Michael, what ideas did you hear from candidates that sounded like good ones to you? What would we need to see a future mayor from what do we need to see from a future mayor to see real change?
Yeah, I heard quite a few good ideas about or emphasis on waste and the overburdened communities that waste is being handled. I think they, had a really good talking points of what they had in terms of ideas of what they thought was what we kind of wanted to hear and what we need to hear. But I didn't hear them say anything about listening to community as to how are these overburdened communities being affected? What do the communities themselves feel like maybe answers, and how they could work together with communities to create solutions. The communities like ours here in the South Bronx handles all of the Bronx waste in one neighborhood where we have these trucks traversing through communities. That was not really discussed in terms of how the truck entities getting to and from these facilities we change, or policy will be changed about how they avert that effect on our poor air quality and high rates of asthma due to outdoor air quality and the emissions from these vehicles. So I like the idea that it's front and center on their minds as to what they should be doing or should be concentrating on as newly elected officials if they're elected as mayor. But I think the conversation needs to change in terms of how they come up with their policies, unless we're doing the same thing over and over again without really engaging community.
Helps to not be on mute. I think it is really important to engage communities as part of the decision making, and I think people are starting to take a different approach to that, and I think that is important to have a sort of a more ground up from that perspective. So thinking about parks and open spaces, which not only help to reduce emissions and improve air quality, but also provide critical stormwater protection, help reduce the urban heat island effect, and provide safe open spaces for New Yorkers. Adam, did the candidates sound like they were on board with increasing parks funding in the New York City budget? What commitments would you like to see from a future mayor to really get parks the funding that they need?
Yeah, I would say that we are feeling very optimistic about where all of the candidates are positioning parks. Over the last year, our partnership through the Playfair Coalition and all of our advocates have really been pushing a new narrative around parks as a result of the pandemic, but really as a result of the last 30 years of disinvestment in parks, really talking about parks as critical infrastructure and parks as being a critical part of the recovery of New York. And so one of the platform points that we've been pushing is 1% of the city's budget for parks. And we've seen many of the candidates commit to that number, which is critical for a 21st century park system, and will position New York City as a competitive place from an open space perspective. Beyond those questions, I think, and going to the recovery and investment in parks, there's a whole additional narrative around the economic recovery. And I think, it's easy for parks to be positioned as a luxury or as a nice thing for neighborhoods to have, or even within the environmental realm, and still push them to the side. And I think what we're really pushing with the candidates is that parks need to be a critical part of the economic recovery, and as essential infrastructure, they should be positioned like any other infrastructure, which starts to talk about federal funding and big investment beyond maintenance and operations.
Great. And of course, we'd all love to see them support our Playfair campaign.
That's exactly right.
Thinking of something that nobody thinks of as a luxury here in New York, transportation is an issue where we need to see large-scale emissions reductions and a massive investment in infrastructure. Danny, how'd the candidates do?
Well, we are so encouraged because we're hearing from candidates this year about buses and bus speeds and bus riders in a way we never heard before. Buses have been ignored in every single campaign to date, and now buses are finally getting their due. The same way that, last campaign we heard people attacking bike lanes. We're not hearing that from candidates now. We're hearing from candidates a recognition and a realization that it's time to make our streets much fairer and much safer by putting transit first. And, the way to do that certainly is to implement the streets master plan law and roll out 30 new miles of bus lanes every year, starting next year for the next 5, in accordance with a citywide master plan that recognizes that buses have a citywide benefit. And that means, going to Michael's point, that when city planners consult community members, they consult the community members with the biggest stake in the outcome, which are, of course, bus riders, and not just bus riders from one given block where a bus lane is, but bus riders all along a route, sometimes bus route riders from one borough to another borough, so that we don't just let parochial concerns tie up where we put in transit priority infrastructure, but we actually consider the needs of the New Yorkers who are on the bus. And that's where equity comes in, because if you look at who is on the bus, 75% of bus riders are low-income New Yorkers of color, people for whom the bus is so often an obstacle, but should be an engine of opportunity. And so we are starting to hear that from candidates, but what we want to hear is a commitment to delivering for bus riders. And we want to see it play out, and whoever takes City Hall next year, that they roll out bus lanes quickly and effectively in the areas where the bottlenecks are the worst, where they need it most. And that even when there aren't bus lanes, that they do what they can to reduce driving. Because as you pointed out, as Chris pointed out, we have a real emissions crisis in the city, and our transit system is extensive. It's low-hanging fruit. We can make the most of it, but we need to cut our emissions. And unfortunately, transportation emissions from private cars have been flat for the last 15 years. Bloomberg didn't move the needle. De Blasio hasn't moved the needle. The next mayor must move the needle on transportation emissions, and that's by putting transit first on our streets.
Great. And I was heartened to hear some folks recognize the need for congestion pricing as part of that, needing to tackle congestion, something that we hope will start moving forward quickly. So climate change and environmental protection is not only good for the environment, but supports tens of thousands of family-sustaining jobs. Two main areas where green jobs can be created are in parks maintenance and building retrofits. Chris and Adam, can you speak to this needed investment? How did the candidates address this green job question?
Absolutely. Chris, do you want to go first?
Sure, I can speak to the green jobs question in the retrofit context. So this is absolutely true. It's absolutely critical. Green jobs in the building sector are good jobs. They are in design, construction, building operations and management, and a whole range of other fields. They're well-paid jobs, living wage jobs, many are union jobs. I think we heard from all of the candidates a recognition of the significant potential for green jobs in the building sector, particularly with retrofitting buildings. We'd like to see more detailed plans and steps on how to get to those green jobs, but it's really encouraging to see that directional emphasis. At Urban Green, we view retrofits as an investment need, but it's also a huge opportunity. So building retrofits bring green jobs. They also bring a host of other benefits, including better building systems, the ability to control temperature in individual apartments, which many of us don't have, high efficiency air conditioning where it doesn't exist now. That's an increasingly important issue with more heat waves, with more significant climate change. Less energy use, which translates into lower utility bills, better air quality from less fossil fuel combustion. So there are really a lot of benefits here. They're all part of investment in the green economy, and I think we really did see a recognition of that sort of high level priority. Urban Green's actually estimated this investment opportunity in the context of Local Law 97. We asked, what would it take to get all buildings to comply with their 2030 targets, so over the next decade, using energy efficiency alone? And we found a $20 billion market opportunity. Julie, you mentioned thousands of jobs. We found 141,000 jobs could be stimulated by that energy efficiency. Now, a lot of buildings will choose a variety of options, but that's the energy efficiency path, and there's a lot of benefit to that. So encouraging to hear the emphasis on green jobs. Again, we'd like to see sort of more development of the concrete steps, looking at near to medium term workforce needs, collaborating with the state, utilities, nonprofits like Urban Green and others that are focused on education and training to support this green jobs transition in the building sector.
That's fantastic. On the parks side, I think there are a couple of different ways that we can talk about jobs. Obviously, this last year, the Parks Department and its staff were just gutted. So we're not in a normal year. But they were gutted from a place that wasn't a sustainable model. So many of the parks employees are seasonal or temporary employees. And so there's not a kind of professional core of parks workers that are working in our parks year in and year out. The discussion about raising the parks budget to 1% of the overall city budget is implicit in that is a massive increase in park staffing and permanent parks jobs and a permanent sort of professional parks core that will, I think, most fundamentally address the inequities of park maintenance around the city, particularly out in the boroughs. So that is critical. And one part of that certainly is, and not the only part, but one part that I think is timely now is the idea of increasing the Parks Enforcement Patrol positions. These are people who are in many of the parks, kind of there as ambassadors more than anything, and are, in our minds, are a much better option than calling, for example, the police department to bring in PD to be addressing issues in our parks. That's a way to, again, build a more permanent staffing on that level for the Parks Department, and a much better way for the Parks Department to be interacting with communities that they serve. The second thing I would mention, a second part of our platform, is really addressing the inaccessibility of parks throughout New York City, particularly in the boroughs. There are many neighborhoods and community boards in New York City that just do not have access to parks, do not have a park within 10 minutes. And one of our platforms, along with our partner at Trust for Public Land, is to really address that by building new parks. And parks construction itself is a job creator, both in the construction industry, then in the maintenance and operations of the parks. But beyond that, again, as I was talking about parks as a part of the economic recovery, your new parks are facilitating businesses around those parks. And again, the economic impact goes well beyond the park itself. So I think making sure the candidates are seeing these as opportunities for employment, for economic recovery is critical.
That's a lot of jobs and a lot of new parks, in particular in areas that are really underserved. And of course, we want to make sure those parks are safe, clean, and accessible. So it's a great opportunity both for greening our buildings and for making sure people have access to parks. So open streets is something that we've spent a lot of time talking about over the last year. I think the pandemic has really brought this to the forefront, people needing a space to go outside. And we know that's an important matter for the next mayor. We need to see a commitment to expand the current program to prioritize families over dirty and dangerous cars. Michael and Danny, can you comment on the need for an open streets plan? And do you think the candidates address this need?
Danny, you want to take the lead on that and I'll follow up?
I can try. So, open streets are incredibly important to our communities, and it's important that they're built out equitably, and that's why we need a plan. When we don't have a plan, we end up reproducing inequity, and that unfortunately was part of the story of last year's initiative of open streets. So we need to do better than that, and we need a real plan from the candidates. We work closely with the group Transportation Alternatives, which has proposed that by 2025, we should reallocate 25% of the space on our streets away from cars and for people, for children and families. And I think that that's an excellent start. It has to be done in consultation with communities. But again, we have to look at the right participants, the participants with the greatest stake in opening up our streets, and that's the people who will take advantage and use them. And so, in the case of open streets, it is important to consult children, to consult parents and families and caretakers and see where and how we can make open streets most effective, most equitable, and safe.
I totally agree with you, Danny. I think it was a good opportunity to really get people outside when they really needed it the most during this pandemic. Again, you're right, it wasn't equitable in terms of where those opportunities were. I like the idea. I think the candidates really talked a lot about open streets being a good idea to continue the program and enhance on it. I think we do need to look outside the box a little bit on that, not only being open streets, but open green permeable surfaces that are permanent, right? Where it's not, so building off the idea around parks, but maybe more local, small gathering areas where people can actually be in a place where it's not going to be a heat island, right? I mean, we look at the South Bronx, we don't need more asphalt being play areas, because that's what our playgrounds are, which are in the summer when it's extremely hot. It's not a place children want to be during the day. But it was a permeable surface with treescapes, green grass, some sort of more of a natural resource. Let that be our open streets. Create those spaces in places where they are totally underserved and overburdened with lack of green space, like was mentioned, especially like in the South Bronx, we have like the lack of the lowest quantity of green space per capita in any other community in the city. So that's those areas that are not being really given the opportunity to be within green space, because we have one park for like 60,000 people. Add those spaces and those places and build upon what we've already started, but think outside the box and making them more permeable surfaces, make them really small parks and not more playgrounds. I think that those kind of concepts are coming from communities as well. I mean, we're trying to spend more time in community gardens because we don't have the green space in the permeable surface locations to actually recreate, which makes us healthier people. And I think COVID has really pulled the scab off of a lot of injustices and inequities. And that plays out in our access to green space, but also into like quality of life enhancements. And those spaces are also economic drivers. We've never looked at green space as being an economic driver before. When you bring folks to those kind of spaces, make them healthier, that's an economic benefit, but it's also a job creator, because then you have entrepreneurs able to open up business around these places where people are coming to recreate. So I think that's a really important point. I like the fact they're talking about it. I think more needs to be built upon that program.
I think that's exactly right. It's about safer mobility. It's about reprioritizing people over cars, and that takes a lot of different forms and in different communities. And you're right. We do need to be thinking about our parks as economic part of the economy, and also part of what makes people like happy. Happy and healthy, right? You're happier when you're looking at something that's green than when you're looking at asphalt. It's not as inspiring. So I want to thank everybody. We hope you enjoyed this panel discussion and hearing about where mayoral candidates stand on the environment. As I mentioned earlier, we produced this video to keep the environment a top priority for politicians and for voters. One of the best ways to advocate for climate change is to show candidates that it's important to us. That's why we hope you will consider what you learned tonight when you cast your ballot. Don't forget that the deadline to register to vote is May 28th. Early voting starts on June 12th and runs through June 20th, and primary day is on June 22nd. Please follow us on at NYLCV on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram for updates. And if you're not already on our email list, please sign up at www.nylcvef.org. Thank you. We hope you enjoy the rest of this Earth Month.